Axel, can you do me a favor? Can you just lift this microphone up?
There we
Yeah,
go.
just that middle screw right there, that big screw. I can see it slowly going down.
Yeah.
What is good, guys? Welcome back to Your Place Next Door, the #1 mental health podcast in the world. So today we've got a very special guest. His name is Nadir. He is a grief counselor. Now, personally, I've never dealt with a close loss in my life. I've never had the need for a grief counselor, but recently we lost a dog, and feeling that loss, is quite effective. So, today we're gonna pick his brain and just get into this. So, yeah, how you doing today?
Doing well, man. You're doing okay?
Yeah, I'm very good
Nice
today.
to be here.
Awesome. Appreciate you coming down.
Absolutely.
All right. So first of all, let's just dive into this straight away. What is a grief counselor?
So, what I am is a licensed professional counselor and OPC. I actually fell into grief and trauma counseling by luck, actually. I work at a hospice, so I work with patients with palliative care, end-of-life care. Their families is who I work with. Those are my clients. So sometimes they have a dad, a relative, a spouse passing away. And what I do is help them accept the fact that they have a person passing away and what to do afterwards and the outlook of life looking like afterwards.
Mm-hmm. So how did you actually get into this field? I know you said you fell into it.
I was a pharmacy technician when I was in grad school, when I was doing my master's. And the company I worked for, PharmaCare, was a pharmacy for hospices. So Cantex is the company I work at, and it's a huge, we have about 13 hospices in the Houston area, and I work at Houston Hospice. So when I was working as a technician, I was studying for my boards at the time, and I found out how vast the network of Cantex is, and I was able to talk to supervisors and move my way up, and I got this job as a grief and trauma counselor.
Mm-hmm. So how long you been doing this now?
It's been about 2 years now, 2020.
Mm-hmm.
COVID hit, so it was at the beginning of my career, so it was more telehealth, but now it's more hands-on, so I'm there every day.
I got you. Now, we all know it's inevitable that we will all deal with loss one day, and that's the sad reality of it, but it's the hard truth. Now, in terms of an actual counselor, because like I said, we all go through grief. What are the signs that someone would need a counselor?
When you start detaching yourself from, number one thing as counselors we say is if something is causing endurance to your everyday life, your daily activities, you can't go to work, you're not focusing well, concentration problems, those would be signs that you need a therapist or someone, a professional, to help you navigate those thoughts, especially when you're in something as bereavement, which is another word for grief. It's just a time where someone spends in the grief mourning.
Okay.
So my company, it's voluntary. So I'm an on-site counselor. If they need me, if the family needs me, I'm there. Most people do want to have the on-site counselor. Usually my clientels are 15, 16-year-olds in high school. Sometimes it might be a spouse. And they have their own problems going on at work, at school, trying to figure that out. But at the same time, they have this relative passing away.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this huge cognitive dissonance that they're always in. And I'm there to kind of facilitate how to navigate that.
Okay. And is in terms of like a counselor stepping in, have you noticed, is it like more of a time thing where what you're saying about the like not being able to concentrate and focus and stuff like that, is it over an elongated period of time, or is it more of just it's happened, I need some help getting through this, like they knew that they've never experienced this before, like what's the majority of it?
So when you're in hospice care, it's a sudden shock because palliative care means that the hospitals, they don't have anything left as treatment-wise. So all you're doing is helping them alleviate the pains of end-of-life care. So you give them pain medications and just help them ease their transition into the next, right? So for my clients, it's very tough when they see their relative because it's hard for them to accept. There's actually 7 stages of grief. I'm pretty sure we're going to go over those. And most of them, they're in that sudden shock mode. And when they see that, it's just hard for them to. It's just a good way of putting it. It's like every day you wake up and it's like death because you just don't know when they're going to pass away. I have clients that sometimes I have them for 2 weeks, a month, 6 months. I've never had them longer than 6 months though, because the relative usually passes away. And then we transfer that client out to an outsourced counseling firm.
So do you deal with like leading up to the death?
Yes. So I'm there leading up to the death. And it's actually a very beautiful thing when the family involves you in something like that. It's very humbling, but at the same time, it's rough. It's very tough being there. They want you throughout the whole phase. I usually meet clients 2 to 3 times a week, and I'm there up until the death point.
Okay, and in terms of the actual counseling, like what is the best kind of therapy for?
So I use a wide range of therapy, psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. The best one is free association, where you just let the client just talk about his problems, his or her problems. Usually, it is that their father, their parent, their spouse is on the deathbed, but at the same time, they're struggling in their life too. So it's a lot of deductive based theory. So you just take what you can from their life and try to see what's actually at the bottom of what's actually bothering them, because they've accepted the fact that they have a person passing away. It's just, what do I do afterwards? There's been many times where I've had a client, it was a 33-year-old female, her husband was on the deathbed and he had lung cancer. It was just stage 4. He wanted her to get married before he passed away. That was very rough, and he expected me to kind of help her give that thought, and so in terms of that, it's all a wide range of like things that happen. She didn't end up marrying. He ended up passing away. And the one thing I really hate about my company is, dislike is, after the patient passes away, that's it for me. I have to send them out to an outsourced counselor. So I'm only on site. I can't do any more counseling. I do exit counseling for them 1 session, and that's it. That's one thing that I was telling Miran I want to kind of transition out of, because that's a very vital part. They've been with me the whole time, right? And as someone passes away, I send them off to someone else.
It's like a cold. It's cutting them off cold.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and it's hard for me, it's hard for the client, and it's hard for the other counselor too, because he's going to focus more on the grief, which is understandable. You just had someone pass away. But at the same time, they have problems that are still there before this disease was here, or before the relative was in the hospice.
So everyone you deal with, it's like they know it's coming. It's never like a car accident or something.
No. Palliative, no. I'm usually palliative people on palliative care. They're usually cancer patients.
Terminal illnesses.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay. And just one thing, CBT. That's what you said, right?
Cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah. So break that down a little bit for me. Like, what are those kind of like those treatments? What do they look like?
So cognitive behavioral therapy is a lot of breathing techniques. Cognitive behavior. So we're just gonna break it up. What you're thinking in your mind sometimes isn't, your behavior isn't the same as your cognition, right? So, for example, someone might be going through something. They might feel guilty for the person passing away.
Yeah.
Like it's their fault. I didn't stop them from smoking enough. I didn't do this enough. I should have taken care of their health more. And that in effect affects their behavior, and it changes their cognition. So what I try to do is try to navigate those thoughts out and tell them they're here for this reason. It's an actual, disease. It has nothing to do with what you could have done, should have done, and would have done, right?
Yeah.
Because some of these diseases are just not controllable. So cognitive behavior is just helping them. It's what you're thinking in your mind is not the actual reality. So you do a lot of breathing techniques. You make them be aware of the situation. A lot of the times, what all a counselor does is the answer is within you. We just try to bring it up to life.
Okay.
That's all it is.
Is it like acceptance?
Say it one more time.
Acceptance, like trying to accept the situation. Is that
Acceptance, yes. And yes, acceptance, and to the point where I don't feel guilty for being here. I don't feel guilty for moving on with my life.
okay?
Um, those are the type of things I try to address because a
Okay.
lot of them be like, well, what's gonna happen afterwards? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I should have been, I could have been on the deathbed. Why is he or she there? So stuff like that. Those I try to get clients to think not selfishly, but at the same time, they've drove so much energy into this person, um, and it's inevitable that that person is going to pass away. That's the reason they're in hospice care and not at the hospital. Um, so things like that, I try to help them with.
Okay, and we talked. You mentioned the 7 stages of grief. So what are those?
Um, there's 7 stages. I wouldn't say they're linear, that they go in order, but for the most part, most people exhibit this order. So number one is shock. The fact that, okay, you have a loss of a someone, loss of a job. Spouse is one of the biggest losses you can have, is a loss of a spouse. That's the heaviest for a person. Number two is denial. So most people can't accept the fact that I just lost to someone suddenly. They were here yesterday, they're not here today. They were here a year ago. A year ago, we were doing these things, and now they're not here. Number three, what starts to happen is anger. You start getting angry. And for people that believe in higher beings, it's towards God sometimes. It's just towards themselves sometimes. And that anger can build up to other things like depression, mood disorders, and stuff like that. Number four, you start bargaining. That's the bargaining stage of the grief process, where if you believe in a higher being, you're pleading almost to God, like, God, is there another way?
Mm-hmm.
Can they, is like, I know the doctor said it's a year, but can it be 2 years? I know that any moment they're going to pass away, God, but is there anything I can do that can stop this, right? Number five leads into the depression, because when at bargaining stage, it's inevitable that you're gonna not find the answer in that stage.
It's like you're losing hope almost.
Yes, you're losing hope, and then you hit the depression stage, and this is where people, I think it's the hardest stage. All of these stages are very hard, but the depression stage is, if you're not able to climb out of that, then it's very hard to function in everyday activities. Which leads to the sixth one. It's acceptance and hope. After a while, if you're in a depressive episode, you're going to want to seek help from family members, be it a professional, family members, friends, family. And that hope that, okay, this is in terms of talking about someone who's maybe still alive, right? Not someone who's passed away. That, okay, I've accepted the fact that they have this disease, but I'm hopeful for the future. I hope they can climb out of this. But again, it's not realistic sometimes, which leads them to the seventh one, and it is everyone grieves differently. There's no one way of grieving, so some people skip right to the depression part. They're not even in shock. Or some people are just stay at the denial. They just like, no, this can't be happening to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible. It's not, why us? Stuff like this doesn't happen to our family. Thoughts like those can be very dangerous, because you can get stuck and not be practical about certain situations. And like if a person has a sudden loss, it's even harder, because you're stuck in that denial, and sometimes people get hysterical. They lose themselves. They start hallucinating. They mood disorders, schizophrenics, all those stuff start. Then you start seeing serious problems if it's not addressed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what would you say is the hardest stage of grieving?
I would say denial. If you're not able, denial and acceptance. If you're not able to do those things, you deny the fact, okay, this is not happening to me. But if you're not able to accept it, then it gets very, very hard to move on with life. Sometimes it just depends on the person. Sometimes the shock in and of itself is too much. And then they start having physiological responses. They can't concentrate. They don't have an appetite. stuff like that. So when things are getting into everyday life, everyday activities, and they're hindering, that's when you know it's time to see a professional.
How does grief affect the brain?
In many ways, there's certain neurotransmitters that you start, like dopamine, serotonin. These are our happy kind of transmitters that give us happiness, give us joy, our appetite. And when you're in bereavement, there's something called bereavement. It's the state of mourning and the state of grief. So when someone is bereaved, a lot of things start happening. They start losing concentration. Um, the wiring of their brain actually changes. There's been studies where people who have been in stressful situations, they do MRI images before and afterwards, and you can see how the brain, certain transmitters are not firing.
Hmm.
So a lot of them end up taking medication to help alleviate some of the lost joy they have in life. Part of the reason why I became a counselor is to kind of take away from the medication. Medication is important, it's there, but at the same time, therapy is very overlooked.
Hmm.
There's just stigma behind it. It's like if I'm seeing a counselor, what are people
I had this
thinking?
conversation with another doctor from University of Houston about the medication. I'm a strong believer in not liking the medication.
Sure.
But the point she made, which was a very valid point, was she kept calling it a chemical soup inside your head. And it's like when you have that chemical imbalance, those medications help bring you back. Because after, for example, you've been going through depression for a long time, your brain has changed and is
Absolutely.
now flooded with that depression.
Yes.
And it's hard to bring it back without medication.
Without medication, absolutely.
Yeah. And I was like, because I was prescribed blood pressure tablets at the start of the year, and I was like, if I get used to it, my body will be reliant on it.
Relying on it, and then
So I was like, okay, less smoking, less junk, and a bit more movement,
absolutely.
and it stabilized.
Yeah.
After 1 week, I was like, I told my wife, no, I don't want to use these.
Right.
I'll stabilize it, and I did, in a couple of months. And that's what I'm always like against it, because one, we're biological beings, even though that we do produce all these chemicals, but then I'm a very like, how to say it, like I always think like about cavemen,
Right.
Like,
What were they doing back then before
yeah,
these
yeah, yeah, yeah.
medications?
Did
Right.
they
Yeah.
need this? Did they need
Right.
this?
Because in the United States, we're kind of known as there's a pill for everything, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
if you're
yeah.
unhappy, they take this. If you want to lose weight, take this.
Yeah.
So there is this huge business, right, behind pushing these medications. And I'm not saying these medications are wrong, because some people, like you said, they have this chemical imbalance, and therapy is not gonna give serotonin, or it's not gonna, for a moment it might release dopamine, but not at the level where if you take a medication that is gonna bring you back to, not back to normal, essentially.
Yeah, rebalance.
Yes.
Is the death of a loved one considered trauma?
Absolutely. Like one of the biggest traumatic deaths, or is the death of a spouse, and believe it or not, a death of a pet is actually very, very traumatic for people. And it's, especially a pet, if it's very innocent, right?
Yeah.
And when something like that goes away, it really makes a person readjust or rethink how life is and what life is.
Yeah.
It's definitely traumatizing. And death, I feel like in society, it's guaranteed, right? Death is gonna happen. But the fact we don't have conversations of death, what is death and how to understand it. I'm not talking about a religious aspect. I'm just talking about the fact that religion or not religion, that everyone has to die, right?
Yeah.
So how do we come to terms of that, and how do we? Because sometimes we live life like we're gonna be here forever, and that's not the case, right? And that's why when someone does pass away, it's this sudden trauma that hits, because it was the unknown. Death is still in the unknown. It's very certain, but it's still unknown, right?
Yeah, that's the it's a hard pill to swallow.
Yes, yes. And it's inevitable that's gonna happen. So that's when it can be very traumatic.
Okay. And so the trauma, the tragedy at Uvalde recently. one of the parents of the victims, um, they died almost immediately after the news, and
That sudden shock, right? It's
yeah,
they can have a heart attack or that sudden. Yeah. I'm not sure how they pass, but it's just that sudden
yeah,
shock that sometimes they don't even go through the grieving process because in today's world, some of the things that we're seeing is even as counselors, right? It's like, okay, how do I address this now? Because it's all unknown to me, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's just
yeah,
what drives a person to go into a school and just, I mean, mass murder children for no reason but their own misleadings or misguidings, right? And I hate that some of these people that I'm sorry, I'm going at a tangent, but some of these mass murderers they get the label of, okay, he was going to mental health issues. It's not actually fair for the people that go to mental health issues, bipolar, uh, split personality disorder, depression, anxiety. They're not over here thinking about killing people. They're just worried about, okay, how can I function? How can I get out of bed today?
mm-hmm.
So for the media to label, okay, he was a 16-year-old kid and he had some trouble. He might have some trouble, yes, but at the same time, if those parents are providing weapons and all this stuff, right, it doesn't make it any better.
It's a
So,
terrorist.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't like to just say it was mental health for some of these things that we're seeing. And it's a lot of copycat things that happen because in social media age, everyone wants to be known. And most of these kids, they were showing signs of depression, anxiety. So there's ways of addressing some of these things. Apparently, that the Uvalde shooter, the day of he was dismissed from school, they because he was something was going on with him, and he came back. Um, those are some of the things that need to be addressed, right? And not just if someone is saying they're feeling these because schizophrenics they talk um, in very dark ways, and but you have to help navigate those thoughts out.
What do you think of the state of mental health as over the country as a whole?
It's coming into light now, but
Do you think it's coming into light, or do you think it's becoming worse? That's what I've asked quite a few people.
it's coming into light, and in aspect, it is getting worse because now it's a trend now more than anything, right? Just like anything else,
Yeah,
it's a trend. Oh, mental health. This most companies are now offering mental health services, and that's good. That's necessary. But at the same time, there's this stigma still behind therapy and what therapy is. It's still a lot of unknown out there. Um, so, in terms of people accepting the fact, yeah, mental health is there, and people do have certain issues and certain things they would like to solve with a professional. I feel like in the past 5 or 10 years, yes, it has changed dramatically. Um, it is for the better, but it can. There's other ways that we can facilitate that too,
hmm.
like school counselors. I don't know if you were you in Houston for high school.
No, no, I'm from UK.
Okay, so the high school counselors here would just help us sign up for classes. That was what their job was. So in terms of like having a school on-site counselor that helps address some of these issues that people go through, kids go through on a daily basis is very necessary. Um, so in terms of that and funding, I think mental health needs to be funded more, a lot
Huge
more.
problem.
Huge problem of funding, yeah. And it's just it's just one of those things that if we don't catch on now, we're gonna keep seeing some of the sort of barbaric things that we're seeing now. Um,
It's what you were saying earlier about these big pharmaceutical companies. It's almost it's tough to say, but it's almost like it's more profitable for them to not find a cure.
yes,
And while we know there's so many different aspects to mental health and so many things can like add to it or take away from it, you know, is a big puzzle. But the funding, the governor of Texas, he removed more than $200 million worth of funding from the budget for mental health. And again, that's a huge problem.
huge problem.
And like I said, these big corporations, they profit from illness and all of that kind of
Absolutely,
stuff, and
absolutely.
that's a big problem in itself. Um, what was I gonna say? Um, yeah, so our whole outlook is with the schools. I think it was 2 days ago, there was a study released that 70%, 70, so nearly all of Texas teachers were considering leaving their jobs.
It's so funny you mentioned that. My wife, she's actually trying to get into teaching,
Uh-huh.
but it's the fact of just the budget and the
Yeah.
safety.
Yeah.
And Texas
Yeah,
just
that's a big thing.
it's crazy in this day and age that you have to worry about um, just the safety of your children. Clear backpacks. A kid has to bring clear backpacks just so a
Yeah.
weapon can't be snuck in. It's like, where are we headed as a community?
Mm.
Where are we going as a society? Um, these are not these are not the certain things that a kid needs to be exposed to. Hey, you need to take a clear backpack because there are certain people out there that
Might have a gun. Yeah.
might have a gun in their backpack.
Yeah.
Or we're gonna have, before it was hurricane drills, right? We would get under the desk, but now they're having drills for
Active shoes.
active shooters, and that's traumatic for a kid who's in kindergarten or elementary school students, right? And how do we explain that to them, right? Besides, like, and the teachers, it's a huge responsibility on them. A lot of teachers lose their life too. I think 2 teachers lost their life in a Uvalde shooting.
Yeah.
Again, like, how do you address these problems? How do you explain to a child what's going on in the world?
And that's the toughest thing. With that survey, it was obviously we're saying about safety, stuff like that. Teachers not making enough money. I mean, that varies like by county or whatever, and by position.
Sure.
But as a whole, like the curriculum doesn't focus on any kind of mental health. It's all just like textbook,
Just
maths,
memorize this and do this.
You know what I
and
mean?
and
It's
yeah,
crazy.
and it is. It's just, that's our school system, right? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I mean, but at the same time, each individual, each student is different. Each coming from a different background. Some coming from single family homes. Some coming from lower socioeconomic statuses, higher socioeconomic statuses. Parents that are not there. Parents that are too involved. Parents that are not involved. So all of these dynamics play a part. And when you have a school system like ours or in America, it's just either you study or or you're left behind.
Mm.
And I was one of the slow learners. I needed time. And believe it or not, they put me in. I was born and raised in Houston. They put me in ESL in elementary, English as a second language.
Okay.
Although I was born here, just because I wasn't able to catch up on some things, right? Because my parents came here in the 1990s with absolutely nothing. So some of the things at home weren't the greatest things, right? And it would transfer over to my academia. But back in the 90s or in the early 2000s, mental health was nowhere,
Didn't hear about it.
It was the silent Gary Coopers of the world, just keep quiet and just move on. And now I'm glad we're talking about it, but is it the right conversation? Are we having the right conversation with these children? Or is it the fact that we're just preparing them for something? Hey, this is the world now, and this is what you have to accept.
Yeah, that's the problem. So, our whole idea was to, tap into the schools and tap into, the curriculum with younger age students. Essentially, they spend quite a good chunk of their life in schools. And, what you're saying about every student being a different personality.
Individual, absolutely.
The resources provided to schools, like, who was it? It was, I can't remember, but they were saying that one teacher would see hundreds of students. And it's like they can't get to know and understand,
No.
there's something off with them
Yeah,
today.
right.
You know what I mean? I'm from the UK where everything is on a much smaller scale.
Sure.
Like the whole UK is 4 countries, right? It's smaller than Texas. Yeah, it's smaller than Texas. And when I was like 8 years old, the school I went to, like the elementary, over there it's called primary, I think the whole school had about 50, 60 students
Wow.
in the school, and that's 8 years of studying.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's like they know if something's off with this kid,
Right.
because they get
Because
to
the
know them.
ratios, yeah, they have.
Exactly.